Hi all, so today we're going to be looking at William Shakespeare's sonnet number 71, No Longer Mourn for Me When I Am Dead. Now this sonnet, along with many of his other sonnets, were dedicated to a mysterious W.H., someone whose identity still remains a mystery, although researchers do believe that this person was in actual fact William Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke. So this person, William Herbert, is frequently acknowledged as W.H. Now, this poem forms part of a group of 4 sonnets in which the speaker contemplates his own mortality. In other words, the speaker, or Shakespeare in this case, is starting to think about him dying. And in the case of this poem, he is admonishing the listener, or his lover, probably most likely this W.H., not to mourn for him excessively once he has died. Right, so let's read through the poem, after which we can start to discuss it. Sonnet 71. No longer mourn for me when I am dead. No longer mourn for me when I am dead. Then you shall hear the surly, sullen bell give warning to the world that I am fled from this vile world with vilest worms to dwell. Nay, if you read this line, remember not the hand that writ it, for I love you so, that I in your sweet thoughts would be forgot, if thinking on me then should make you woe. Oh, if I say, you look upon this verse, when I perhaps compounded am with clay, do not so much as my poor name rehearse, but let your love even with my life decay, lest the wise world should look into your moan, and mock you with me after I am gone. So if we look at the poem in terms of structure, we know that Shakespearean sonnets are normally written in 3 quatrains and a rhyming couplet. So if we look at the rhyme scheme there, we'll see that it's A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and G, G. And you can see I've color-coded it there into the 3 quatrains and the rhyming couplet. Now the other significant thing about Shakespearean sonnets is that very often each quatrain deals with the theme in a slightly different manner, and then the rhyming couplet normally provides a twist or a volta at the end of the poem. Now in this poem we don't really have that twist or that volta, we rather have a summation of the poem. There's kind of like a summing up of the poem in the rhyming couplet. Now if we look at the 3 quatrains of the poem, the first quatrain refers to the fact that the speaker's lover should not mourn for him longer than it takes a funeral bell to toll. The second quatrain talks about the fact that the speaker's lover should not think about him while reading his poetry if it makes him sad. Then the third quatrain talks about the fact that the speaker's lover should let his love decay or pass away in the same way that a body would decompose. And then our rhyming couplet kind of sums us all up and says that he must do all of these in case the world mocks him after the poet or the speaker is gone. Apart from the 3 quatrains and the rhyming couplet, one must also remember that Shakespearean sonnets are written in Iambic Pentameter. So very simply this means that there are 10 syllables in each line with 5 feet, starting on an unstressed syllable. Now you'll see that I've written the first line out just below there, and I've bolded the stressed syllables and I've left the others normal. So you'll see that it starts on an unstressed and then a stressed, and it's divided into your 5 feet. Now, like I mentioned before, this poem is about mourning for someone once they're dead, and in fact the speaker is admonishing his lover not to mourn for him once he is dead. Now if we start looking at the poem line by line, we'll see that one needs to kind of see the first 2 or 3 lines as one, where it says, no longer mourn for me when I'm dead, then you shall hear the surly sullen bell. Right, but if we have a look at that first line on its own, the speaker there is saying, no longer mourn for me. Now, one can read into that the speaker's lover is possibly already mourning for the fact that he might die at this point. So he's saying here that once he's dead, the lover should not continue to mourn for him. What he also wants in this first line is for his lover to move on when he is dead, when he dies. So it says, no longer mourn for me when I am dead. Then you shall hear the surly, sullen bell. Now it was the done thing during the Renaissance for the bell to toll once at your funeral for every year that you lived. So what the speaker is suggesting here is that the listener or his lover should only mourn for him as long as that bell at the funeral would toll. Notice also here the use of alliteration with the repetition of the S sound, and there's also personification here in terms of the bell, because if you think of it, surly means to be bad-tempered and unfriendly, while sullen also very similarly means to be bad-tempered and sulky. Now obviously these are emotions that a bell cannot feel, so you'll see that the bell itself, those emotions are actually what the people at the funeral should be feeling. They should be feeling bad-tempered and sulky because the speaker has died. So that bell tolling is kind of like symbolic of the fact that they are allowed to feel that way while it is tolling. Then we also see here what the bell does, the surly sullen bell. It gives warning to the world that I am fled. In other words, it's telling the world, announcing to the world that the speaker has fled. And that word fled there means that he has died, that he's moved on to the afterlife. And what has he done? He says he's from this vile world with the vilest worms to dwell. And notice there that we have the alliteration with the W, world and worms, and we have the alliteration with the V, vile, over there. Now, these words, vile and vilest, tell us something about the attitude of the speaker. It means he has a little bit of derision towards the world itself. In other words, he doesn't like the world that he's had to live in a way it's almost like he's fleeing away from this terrible world. So in other words, he doesn't like the world and he's running away from it. So dying here is almost something good for him, which is once again a reason as to why his lover should not mourn for him. But when he dies, what's he going to be doing? He's going to be dwelling with the vilest worms. Now, the worms here is a reference to the decaying of the body and the worms that would eat the body. And Shakespeare, in many of his plays, for instance, Hamlet, likes to use that image of the worms feasting on the body over there. So what's he doing? He's escaping from this world, he's fleeing from this world, and he's going to live with the worst worms that are going to eat his body. Right, so now that's our first quatrain, dealing with the fact that his lover should not mourn for him any longer than it should take the bells at his funeral to toll. As we move into the second quatrain, we'll see that he says there, nay, if you read this line, remember not the hand that writ it. So in other words, if the speaker's lover reads his poetry, he should not remember who wrote it. In other words, he mustn't think of Shakespeare when he reads his poetry. Now, of course, there's a little bit of a sense of irony in there, in that if you read the poetry, someone's poetry, for instance here, Shakespeare's poetry, you're obviously going to think about Shakespeare or the poet when you read that poetry. So it's almost, there's an impossibility in that over there. Now there's also a figure of speech over here called Synecdoche. Now Synecdoche is when a part of something represents or symbolizes the whole. So over here we have line, which represents the whole poem or all of his poetry, not just that line of poetry. And we also have the hand there, which is a symbol for the poet as a whole. So if you think of it, then the poet or the speaker is actually saying that if you read my poetry, don't think of me. In other words, don't think of the person that wrote it. So it says, for I love you so that I and your sweet thoughts would be forgot. So what he's saying there is that he would rather be forgotten than to make his love sad through thinking of him. So in other words, even if his lover reads his poetry, he doesn't want him to even think of him in case that makes him sad. Now there's another sense of irony here, because in many of Shakespeare's other sonnets, there's a reference to poetry being a tool for immortality. In other words, the writing of poetry creates a sense of immortality, which in a way it does, because if you think of Shakespeare as an example, his works live on hundreds of years after he himself lived. Right, so he says, remember not the hand that writ it, for I love you so that I and your sweet thoughts would be forgot, if thinking on me should make you woe. In other words, if thinking about the speaker should make his lover sad, where the word woe is, then he doesn't want that. Right, as we get into the third quatrain, you'll see he says there, oh, if I say, you look upon this verse, when I perhaps compounded am with clay. So what he's saying here is that if his lover looks upon this verse, looks upon this poetry, when the speaker himself is compounded with clay. In other words, when his body is decomposed and turned to clay. I think about it, when a body decomposes, it just returns to the earth. Okay, the natural cycle of life. So it says, when this happens, if you look at if his lover looks at his poetry, he says, do not so much as my poor name rehearse, but let your love even with my life decay. So what he's saying there is that his lover mustn't think about his name. He mustn't rehearse his name. He mustn't consider him or feel sad about him. He must let his love with his life decay. In other words, in the same way as a speaker's life and body would decay in the ground, would eventually become compounded with clay, so must his love be. It must decay and degrade. And of course, this links nicely into that first stanza where the speaker says, the first quatrain where the speaker says, don't mourn for me longer than it would take the bells at my funeral to toll. Right, and then lastly we look at the rhyming couplet at the end of the poem, and it starts off saying, lest the wise world should look into your moan. Now we'll see there's another alliteration there with wise world, the repetition of the W, but notice there's a difference there between the wise world and in line 4 we had the vile world. Now I already talked about the vile world and about how the speaker possibly sees the world he lives in as being vile. Here it would be the rest of the world that see themselves as wise, looking at the sorrow of the speaker's lover. And when it looks at the sorrow of the speaker's lover and the fact that the speaker's lover still mourns for the speaker once he's dead, then there's the possibility that they will mock you with me after I'm gone. In other words, they will tease him, mock him, berate him with the speaker after he's gone. In other words, mock him for still mourning with the speaker. So you'll see here that that couplet actually sums up the poem, whereas we will usually see in Shakespearean sonnets there's a kind of a twist at the end, but here we see that this couplet actually provides a nice little bit of a resolution to the poem. In other words, it kind of gives him a solid reason as to why he should forget about the speaker. Alright, cheers, thank you.